I was standing in my backyard, admiring the greenhouse. I'd just finished building when I saw her marching across my lawn like she owned the place, clutching a manila folder against her chest like it contained nuclear launch codes. My name is Yannick Walsh, and I'd moved to this quiet suburb of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, about 8 months ago after landing a remote software engineering job that finally let me escape the chaos of Chicago. The house was perfect, a renovated 1920s bungalow with a massive backyard that backed up to a small wooded area. The previous owners had let the yard go to seed, but I saw potential. I'd always wanted to grow my own vegetables and maybe some exotic plants. The greenhouse was the culmination of months of planning and 3 solid weeks of construction with my buddy Derek helping out on weekends. The woman storming toward me was somewhere in her mid-50s, with that particular shade of blonde that comes from a box and a haircut that screamed, "I need to speak to the manager." She wore expensive yoga pants and a fitted jacket, both pristine despite the muddy spring ground. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you Yannick Walsh?" I set down the bag of potting soil I'd been holding. "That's me. Can I help you?" She stopped about 10 feet from my greenhouse, looking at it like it was a radioactive waste dump. "I'm Brenda Patterson, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. I'm here about this structure you've erected on your property." I glanced back at my greenhouse. It was beautiful, if I do say so myself. 12 by 20 feet, made of cedar frames and polycarbonate panels, with proper ventilation and a small solar panel on the roof to power a fan and some grow lights. I'd even matched the trim color to my house. The greenhouse. What about it? Brenda opened her folder with theatrical precision. According to Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA covenant, all outbuildings must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee at least 30 days prior to construction. You failed to submit any such request. I felt my jaw tighten. "I'm sorry. What HOA?" Her eyebrows shot up. "The Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, the HOA that governs this entire neighborhood." "Right, except I'm not part of any HOA. I specifically looked for houses that weren't in an HOA when I was buying. That was one of my main requirements." Brenda's expression shifted from surprise to condescending in about half a second. "Mr. Walsh, this entire development is part of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. Every property within these boundaries is subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions." "Lady, I don't know what you're talking about. I reviewed all my closing documents with a fine-toothed comb. There was nothing about an HOA." She pulled out a photocopied map from her folder, pointing at a highlighted area. "See this boundary? Your property is right here, well within our jurisdiction. The HOA was established in 2008 when this development was created." I took a closer look at the map. My address was indeed within the highlighted area, but something felt wrong about this entire situation. "Even if that's true, I never signed any HOA agreement. I never received any documentation about an HOA. My realtor never mentioned it, and it wasn't in any of the paperwork I signed." Brenda's smile was pure ice. "Whether or not you sign doesn't matter. The covenant runs with the land. If you own property in this development, you're bound by the rules." "That's not how contracts work," I said, feeling my temper starting to rise. "You can't enforce rules on someone who never agreed to them. This greenhouse comes down, Mr. Walsh, or we'll take legal action. You have until the end of the month to remove it and restore your yard to its previous condition. You'll also be facing a fine of $200 per day for every day the structure has been standing without approval." I did some quick math in my head. The greenhouse had been up for about 3 weeks. "You're trying to fine me over $4,000. $4,200 to be exact, plus $50 per day going forward until the violation is remedied. She handed me a formal-looking letter from her folder. This is your official notice. You can appeal to the board at our next meeting on May 15th, but I doubt that'll go anywhere. The rules are quite clear. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Walsh, that vegetable garden you've started along the fence line, that's also a violation. Vegetable gardens must be screened from view of neighboring properties. I suggest you address that as well. I stood there watching her walk back across my lawn, her heels leaving little divots in the grass. The letter in my hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I looked back at my greenhouse, at the tomato seedlings I'd planted just yesterday, at the cucumber starts, and the pepper plants I'd been nurturing indoors all winter. There was no way in hell I was taking this down. That evening, I spread out every document from my home purchase across my dining room table. The purchase agreement, the title insurance policy, the deed, the disclosure statements, every single piece of paper. I went through them line by line, looking for any mention of a homeowners association, any covenant or restriction, any indication that I'd agreed to be governed by someone else's rules. Nothing. I found the contact information for my realtor, Jennifer Martinez, and sent her an email explaining the situation. Then I started Googling Iowa HOA laws. What I found was interesting. In Iowa, HOAs are governed by Chapter 499B of the Iowa Code, but the enforceability of covenants depends heavily on whether they were properly disclosed and whether the homeowner actually agreed to them. The next morning, Jennifer called me back. Yannick, I'm looking through my files now. There was absolutely no HOA disclosure for your property. I specifically remember you asking about that, and I verified with the seller's agent that there was no HOA. So what do I do here? You need to get a real estate attorney. This is beyond my expertise, but I can tell you that if there was an HOA and it wasn't disclosed, that's a serious problem. Let me give you the number for Steve Wright. He's the attorney I use for complicated closings. Steve Wright's office was in downtown Cedar Rapids, in one of those renovated buildings that managed to keep its historic charm while having modern amenities. I met with him 2 days after Brenda's visit, bringing my entire box of closing documents and the letter she'd given me. Steve was in his early 40s, with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that probably helped his clients not panic. He spent about 30 minutes reviewing everything I'd brought, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. Okay, he finally said, leaning back in his chair. Here's what we've got. First, there is indeed a Meadowbrook Hills HOA. I pulled the records this morning. It was established in 2008, registered with the county, all proper procedures followed. My heart sank. But, he continued, raising a finger, there are some very interesting things about your situation. The HOA covenant states that all properties within the development are subject to the rules, but your property has a quirk in its history. He pulled out a document he'd printed. Your house was built in 1924, long before any development. When the developer bought up surrounding land in 2006 to create Meadowbrook Hills, your property was already there. The developer did acquire several lots adjacent to your property and included them in the HOA, but there's no record of your specific parcel being formally included in the covenant. So I'm not actually in the HOA. It's more complicated than that. The map that Brenda showed you. That's the HOA's claimed boundary, but the actual legal description in the covenant filing doesn't explicitly include your parcel number. It describes the development lots by a specific plat map, and your property isn't on that plat because it predates it. So she's wrong. Probably, but we need to be thorough. The HOA might argue that because your property is surrounded by HOA properties, it's de facto included. That's a weak argument, but we need to be prepared for it. More importantly, even if they had a legitimate claim, which I don't think they do, the complete failure to disclose the HOA at closing could void any obligation you might have had. Steve leaned forward. Here's my advice. Don't take down the greenhouse. Document everything. Take pictures. Save all communications. I'm going to send a letter to the HOA informing them that you dispute their jurisdiction over your property and that you're represented by counsel. That should buy us some time to properly research this. What if they sue? Then we defend, and honestly, I think we'd win. But let me do some more digging first. In the meantime, don't engage with them directly. All communication goes through me. I left Steve's office feeling better but not great. The legal system is never as clean and simple as you want it to be. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into my greenhouse. If I was going to fight for it, I wanted it to be worth fighting for. I installed the shelving systems I'd ordered, set up a proper irrigation system with a timer, and carefully transplanted all my seedlings into larger pots. I started some herbs, some exotic peppers, even some dwarf citrus trees in large containers. The space smelled like earth and growth and possibility. My neighbors on the left side were an older couple, Richard and Susan Chen, who'd lived there for 15 years. I'd chatted with them occasionally but didn't know them well. One evening, Richard came over while I was watering. "Nice greenhouse," he said, admiring the structure. "I heard Brenda came by to give you grief about it." "Word travels fast," he chuckled. "Oh, Brenda makes sure everyone knows when she's enforcing the rules. She's been HOA president for 6 years now, takes it very seriously." "You're in the HOA then?" "Unfortunately, yes. We bought when the development was new, signed all the paperwork." It wasn't too bad at first, but Brenda's regime has been intense. Last year she tried to fine us because our mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Not kidding, we had to pull out paint chips to prove it matched the approved color. That sounds insane. It is. But here's the thing. Richard lowered his voice even though we were alone in my backyard. "I don't think your property is actually in the HOA. I remember when you moved in. Susan and I looked up your house out of curiosity. This place has been here forever. It was here when we moved in, and the old owner, Mr. Kowalski, he used to complain all the time about Brenda trying to make him follow HOA rules. He always told her to pound sand. Did she ever take legal action against him? Not that I know of. He died about 2 years ago, and the property went to his daughter. She fixed it up and sold it to you. But I don't think the HOA ever actually established jurisdiction over this lot." This matched what Steve had told me. It was reassuring to have confirmation from someone who'd been around longer. The board meeting on May 15th was held at the Meadowbrook Hills Community Center, a small building near the neighborhood's main entrance. Steve had advised me not to attend, but I wanted to see this for myself. I had a right to observe even if I wasn't going to participate. The community center was one of those multi-purpose rooms with folding chairs and fluorescent lights. About 20 people were scattered around the room when I arrived. Brenda sat at a table at the front with 4 other board members. She noticed me immediately, and I saw her lips press into a thin line. The meeting started with standard business. Someone complained about a neighbor's lawn care service coming too early in the morning. Someone else wanted approval for a fence. Each item was discussed with an almost painful level of detail. Brenda ran the meeting like a drill sergeant, cutting people off mid-sentence and making unilateral declarations about what was and wasn't acceptable. When we got to new business, Brenda shuffled some papers. We have an ongoing violation at 847 Maple Street. The owner has erected an unauthorized greenhouse and has refused to remove it despite proper notification. I raised my hand. I'd like to address that. This is a board meeting, not a public forum, Brenda said sharply. Homeowners may only speak during the designated public comment period at the end. Sure, but I'm not a homeowner in your association, so I guess I'm just a member of the public observing a meeting. That got everyone's attention. Murmurs rippled through the room. Brenda's face reddened. Mr. Walsh, you are absolutely a member of this HOA, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. Actually, I have a real estate attorney who's reviewed the covenant documents, and he's determined that my property was never properly included in the HOA jurisdiction. You're welcome to discuss this with him. I handed her Steve's business card, which I'd brought for exactly this purpose. One of the other board members, a man with gray hair and glasses, spoke up. Brenda, is this true? Did we verify the property was actually in the HOA before issuing the violation notice? Of course it's in the HOA, Brenda snapped. It's within our boundaries. Being within a geographic boundary isn't the same as being legally bound by the covenant, I said. My property predates your development by about 80 years. It was never part of the original plat, and I never signed any agreement to be governed by your rules. The man with glasses looked troubled. Brenda, I think we need to table this until we can verify the legal situation. If Mr. Walsh is correct, we could be opening ourselves up to liability by continuing to claim jurisdiction. Don't be ridiculous, Harold. The covenant clearly states that all properties within the development boundaries are subject to the rules. But if his property wasn't included in the legal description filed with the county, then it doesn't matter what the covenant says about boundaries, Harold persisted. We can't just claim authority over someone's property without proper legal basis. Another board member, a younger woman, nodded. I agree with Harold. This needs to be reviewed by our attorney before we proceed. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue more, but the other board members were clearly not on board with her aggressive stance. Fine, she said, her voice clipped. We'll table this matter pending legal review. But Mr. Walsh, if it turns out you are subject to the HOA, these fines will continue accumulating. I'll take my chances, I said. I left the meeting feeling victorious but also uneasy. Brenda had the look of someone who didn't accept defeat gracefully. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Cedar Rapids, different from Steve's firm. The HOA had retained an attorney, and they were demanding I cease and desist from operating the greenhouse pending resolution of the jurisdictional question. The letter also stated that the HOA would be seeking an injunction if I didn't comply. I forwarded it to Steve immediately. Well, they're serious about this, Steve said when he called me. But so are we. I've completed my research, and I'm absolutely confident your property is not subject to the HOA covenant. I'm drafting a detailed response that lays out our legal position. If they want to take this to court, we're ready. Is this going to cost me a fortune in legal fees? I'm going to be honest with you, Yannick. If this goes to trial, it could get expensive. But I've got another strategy in mind. I'm going to file a declaratory judgment action first. Basically, we're going to sue them to get a court declaration that your property isn't subject to the HOA. That puts us on offense instead of defense. Do it, I said. I'd been saving money for years, living frugally despite a good income. If there was ever a time to spend some of that savings, this was it. Steve filed the lawsuit the following week. The Cedar Rapids Gazette picked up the story because it was a slow news week, and suddenly, I was getting calls from other homeowners with HOA disputes. Apparently, Brenda's aggressive enforcement had made her plenty of enemies over the years. The HOA's attorney filed a response arguing that the boundaries described in the covenant were clear, and that my property fell within them. They included the same map Brenda had shown me, along with aerial photos and plat maps trying to demonstrate that my property was part of the development. Steve's counter-argument was simple and devastating. The covenant's legal description specifically referenced all lots within the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision as recorded in Plat Book 47, page 23 of the Lynn County records. He'd pulled that plat map, and my property wasn't on it. It was surrounded by lots that were on it, but my specific parcel predated the subdivision and had its own separate legal description that had never been amended or incorporated into the HOA plat. The judge scheduled a hearing for mid-July. In the meantime, Brenda wasn't backing down. She started coming by my property every few days, always staying on the public sidewalk, but taking pictures and making notes on a clipboard. It was creepy and annoying. One afternoon in early June, I was working in the greenhouse when I heard voices in my backyard. I came out to find Brenda with two men in polo shirts emblazoned with Meadowbrook Hills HOA on them. "What are you doing in my yard?" I demanded. "We're conducting an inspection," Brenda said coolly. "The board has authorized us to document violations. Get out, now. This is private property and you're trespassing." One of the men, tall and muscular with a buzz cut, took a step toward me. "We have authority under the covenant to inspect properties for violations." "You don't have authority over me. You're trespassing. Leave now or I'm calling the police." "Go ahead and call them," Brenda said. "They'll tell you the same thing. We have a right to enforce our rules." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, I explained that I had 3 people trespassing on my property who refused to leave. Brenda's confidence faltered slightly, but she held her ground. 2 Cedar Rapids police officers arrived about 10 minutes later. I explained the situation, including the pending lawsuit. Brenda tried to argue that the HOA had the right to enter any property within their jurisdiction. The older of the 2 officers, a sergeant named Morrison, listened patiently to both sides. Then he turned to Brenda. "Madam, do you have explicit permission from Mr. Walsh to be on his property? The HOA covenant grants us the right to inspect." But Mr. Walsh disputes that the covenant applies to him, and there's currently litigation on that exact question, correct? "Yes, but until a court says otherwise, we maintain our rights." Sergeant Morrison shook his head. "That's not how it works. If someone tells you to leave their property and you refuse, that's trespassing, regardless of what some contract might say. Especially when that contract's validity is in dispute. You need to leave now." Brenda's face went through several shades of red. "This is outrageous. We're simply trying to maintain community standards. Then maintain them from the sidewalk. Let's go." The 3 of them left under police escort, Brenda muttering about harassment and abuse of power the entire way. After the officers took my statement and gave me an incident report number, Sergeant Morrison pulled me aside. "Word of advice. Put up some no trespassing signs. Get a security camera or 2 covering your backyard. People like her don't stop just because they get told off once." I took his advice. That weekend, I installed a comprehensive security camera system covering all sides of my property. 4 high-definition cameras with night vision and motion detection, all recording to a network storage device in my basement. I also put up clear no trespassing signs at every entrance to my backyard. The cameras proved their worth faster than I expected. 3 days after installation, at 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I pulled up the camera feed to see someone in dark clothes moving around my backyard. approaching the greenhouse. I called 911 again, then pulled on jeans and a jacket and went downstairs, turning on all my exterior lights. The figure by the greenhouse froze, then ran toward the back fence, climbing over it into the wooded area behind my property. The police arrived quickly. This time it was Sergeant Morrison again, along with a younger officer. I showed them the camera footage, which clearly showed someone attempting to break into the greenhouse, though the dark clothes and a hood made identification impossible. "Can you tell if they took anything or caused any damage?" Morrison asked. We walked out to the greenhouse together. The door handle had scratches around the lock, like someone had tried to pick it or pry it open. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed. "Looks like they didn't get in," I said. "The lock held." "You should know," Morrison said. "We've had reports of some vandalism in this neighborhood over the past few weeks. Broken mailboxes, graffiti on fences, slashed tires. All properties that have been in disputes with the HOA. You think the HOA is behind it. I'm not saying that. But it's an interesting pattern. Keep your cameras running and save all the footage. If this happens again, we'll have more to work with." The attempted break-in shook me more than I wanted to admit. I started keeping my phone next to my bed at night, and I found myself checking the camera feeds compulsively. My greenhouse had become more than just a building. It represented my right to do what I wanted on my own property, and someone trying to sabotage it felt like a personal attack. The July hearing arrived faster than I expected. Steve had prepared meticulously, with binders full of documents, maps, and legal precedents. The HOA's attorney, a stern woman named Patricia Hughes, seemed equally prepared. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Judge Catherine Reynolds. She'd clearly read all the briefs beforehand because she started the hearing by cutting right to the core issue. "Counsel, let me understand the basic facts here. Mr. Walsh's property predates the subdivision, correct?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Steve said. "The house was built in 1924 and the lot has maintained its original legal description since that time. And the HOA covenant was filed in 2008 when the surrounding subdivision was created." "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Reynolds turned to Patricia Hughes. "Counselor, your client's position is that Mr. Walsh's property is subject to the covenant despite never being formally included in the subdivision plat. What's your legal basis for that?" Patricia stood. "Your Honor, the covenant clearly describes geographical boundaries that include Mr. Walsh's property. The intent of the covenant was to govern the entire development area, which includes properties that predated the subdivision. But intent isn't enough, is it? The covenant must have a proper legal description that actually includes the property in question. Your Honor, we believe the boundary description is sufficient. The covenant describes the area as bounded by Cedar Street to the north, Maple Avenue to the south, 15th Street to the east, and the Forest Preserve to the west. Mr. Walsh's property falls within those boundaries." Judge Reynolds flipped through some documents. "But Mr. Wright has pointed out that the covenant also specifically references the plat map, which doesn't include Mr. Walsh's parcel. How do you reconcile that?" The plat map reference was intended to identify the newly created lots, not to exclude existing properties within the boundary. "So your position is that any property within those street boundaries is automatically subject to the covenant, even if never explicitly included and even if the owner never agreed?" "In essence, yes, Your Honor. The covenant runs with the land." Judge Reynolds made a note. "Mr. Wright, your response," Steve stood. "Your Honor, the principle that a covenant runs with the land requires that the covenant actually apply to that land in the first place. You can't claim a covenant runs with land that was never properly encumbered by the covenant." The legal description is explicit. It references specific lots on a specific plat. Mr. Walsh's property is not one of those lots. Furthermore, Steve continued, even if there were ambiguity about the legal description, which there isn't, Mr. Walsh never received any disclosure about the HOA when he purchased the property. Under Iowa Code Section 558.69, any covenant or restriction affecting real property must be disclosed to a purchaser. The complete failure to disclose eviscerates any claim the HOA might have. Judge Reynolds nodded slowly. Miss Hughes, was the HOA disclosed at Mr. Walsh's closing? Patricia looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, that's an issue between Mr. Walsh and his seller. It doesn't affect the validity of the covenant itself. It affects enforceability, though, doesn't it? If Mr. Walsh purchased the property without notice of a covenant, and if the covenant's applicability to his property is questionable at best, why should he be bound by it? Because the covenant is a matter of public record, Your Honor. He could have discovered it through due diligence. But he did conduct due diligence. He specifically asked his realtor about HOAs. He was told there wasn't one. The title company didn't flag it. The seller's disclosure didn't mention it. At what point does the burden shift to the HOA to ensure that properties they claim jurisdiction over actually know about that jurisdiction? Patricia didn't have a good answer for that. Judge Reynolds leaned back in her chair. I'm prepared to rule from the bench on this. Looking at the totality of circumstances, I find that Mr. Walsh's property is not subject to the Meadowbrook Hills HOA covenant. The legal description in the covenant is clear and specific, referencing particular platted lots. Mr. Walsh's property is not among those lots. While the covenant does describe geographical boundaries, that language cannot override the explicit legal description. I felt a wave of relief so powerful I almost laughed out loud. Furthermore, the judge continued, the complete failure to disclose the alleged HOA to Mr. Walsh at the time of purchase would, even if there were a valid claim to jurisdiction, make enforcement unconscionable. Mr. Walsh purchased this property with the explicit understanding that it was not subject to an HOA. To now bind him to rules he never agreed to and didn't know existed would be fundamentally unfair. Judge Reynolds looked at Patricia. Your client is hereby ordered to cease and desist from any enforcement actions against Mr. Walsh or his property. Any fines previously assessed are void. Mr. Walsh is not a member of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, and his property is not subject to its covenant. Steve was grinning as we left the courthouse. That was decisive. She didn't leave any room for them to appeal successfully. You're in the clear. So I can keep my greenhouse. You can keep your greenhouse, plant whatever you want, and they can't say a word about it. We went to a nearby restaurant to celebrate. I ordered a burger and a beer, feeling lighter than I had in months. Steve cautioned me that the HOA might try to appeal, but he thought it was unlikely given how clear Judge Reynolds had been. I drove home that afternoon feeling victorious. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed several of my neighbors were outside. Richard and Susan Chen waved at me, and Richard jogged over. We heard the news, he said, smiling broadly. Judge ruled in your favor, completely. I'm officially not part of the HOA. That's fantastic. Maybe the rest of us should check our property records. If they made a mistake with yours, who knows how many other properties they're claiming jurisdiction over incorrectly? That was an interesting thought. Over the next few days, I heard from several neighbors asking for Steve's contact information. Apparently, there were 3 other properties in the neighborhood that had similar histories to mine, older homes that predated the subdivision. Within a week, 2 of them had hired attorneys to challenge the HOA's jurisdiction, Brenda was not taking this well. I saw her driving past my house multiple times, always slowing down to glare at my greenhouse. She stopped attending to other HOA business and became obsessed with the idea that I'd somehow cheated or manipulated the system. She posted long screeds on the neighborhood Facebook group about property values and maintaining standards, though she never mentioned me by name. Then things took a darker turn. It was early August, a hot Thursday evening. I'd been working late on a project for my job and decided to unwind in the greenhouse, watering plants and checking on my pepper harvest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the polycarbonate panels. I heard a sound outside like breaking glass. I stepped out of the greenhouse to investigate and saw flames spreading across my back fence. Someone had thrown what looked like a Molotov cocktail at it. The old wooden fence was catching fire quickly. I ran for my garden hose, twisting the valve on full. The stream of water hit the flames and I swept it back and forth, trying to contain the fire before it spread. My heart was pounding and I could feel the heat on my face. Behind me, I heard someone shouting. Richard Chen was running over with his own hose, threading it through the hedge between our properties. I called 911, he yelled. Keep spraying. Together, we managed to knock down most of the fire before the fire department arrived. The firefighters finished the job and checked my greenhouse and house to make sure no embers had spread. A section of fence about 10 feet long was completely destroyed, charred black and still smoking. The police came too, and this time they took a very serious interest. Sergeant Morrison examined the remnants of what had been thrown. Definitely a Molotov, bottle, gasoline, cloth wick. This is arson. This is serious. Check my security cameras, I said, suddenly remembering. They should have caught everything. We went inside and I pulled up the footage on my computer. The cameras had indeed caught it. At 8:47 p.m., a figure in dark clothes had approached the back fence from the wooded area. They'd paused, lit something, and thrown it. The angle wasn't perfect, but you could see it was a bottle that shattered against the fence, spreading flames immediately. The figure had run back into the woods. Can you identify who that is? Morrison asked. I studied the footage. The person was wearing dark clothes and a hood, but there was something familiar about the build and the way they moved. I can't be certain, but that looks like one of the guys who was with Brenda Patterson when they trespassed on my property. Morrison made notes. We're going to need a copy of this footage. I'm also going to talk to the detective division about opening a broader investigation into the vandalism pattern in this neighborhood. Over the next few days, the police conducted interviews throughout the neighborhood. They talked to everyone who'd had property damage in recent months, reviewed any security footage people had, and started putting together a timeline. The detective assigned to the case, a sharp woman named Detective Laura Foster, came to my house twice to go over details. I want to be clear about something, she said during her second visit. We're building a case, but these things take time. Whoever did this was careful about not being directly identified, but patterns matter and we're seeing a clear pattern. What pattern? Every property that's been vandalized in the past 6 months has been involved in a dispute with the HOA. Specifically, disputes where Brenda Patterson was personally involved in enforcement action. That's not a coincidence. So you think she's behind it? I think someone acting on behalf of the HOA, or who believes they're protecting the HOA's interests, is behind it. Whether that's Mrs. Patterson directly or someone she's influenced, we're working to determine. A week after the fire, Detective Foster called me. We've made an arrest. Can you come down to the station? At the Cedar Rapids police station, Detective Foster brought me into a small interview room. We arrested Gary Millstone this morning. He's one of the two men who was with Brenda Patterson when they trespassed on your property. We found evidence in his garage connecting him to several of the vandalism incidents, including the Molotov attack on your fence. Did he say why? He claims he was protecting property values, and that people like you who refuse to follow community standards are ruining the neighborhood. He also admits that Brenda Patterson told him and others multiple times that you were a threat to the community and that someone needed to do something about it. So she was inciting people to vandalize my property. That's what we're investigating now. Mr. Millstone is cooperating, hoping for a plea deal. He's given us detailed information about conversations he had with Mrs. Patterson and several other HOA board members. We're building a case for criminal conspiracy. 2 days later, Brenda Patterson was arrested at her home. The local news covered it extensively. The image of her being walked to a police car in handcuffs, still in her designer yoga pants, became briefly infamous on social media. She was charged with conspiracy to commit arson, solicitation to commit vandalism, and several other charges related to the pattern of property damage. The case revealed that she'd been running what amounted to an intimidation campaign against homeowners who challenged the HOA's authority. She'd never directly ordered violence, but she'd created an environment where people like Gary Millstone felt justified in taking extreme action. The fallout was significant. The entire HOA board resigned. The HOA's insurance company started settlement negotiations with everyone who'd been vandalized. Several civil lawsuits were filed against both Brenda personally and the HOA as an entity. In September, I was in my greenhouse harvesting tomatoes when I heard someone call my name. I looked up to see a woman about my age standing near the greenhouse door. She was carrying a basket of what looked like muffins. "Hi, I'm Melissa Ortega. I live 3 streets over. I wanted to thank you for standing up to the HOA. Because of your case, my attorney was able to prove that my property also isn't subject to the covenant. They'd been trying to make me remove my solar panels." "That's great," I said, genuinely pleased. "These are for you," she said, offering the basket. "Homemade blueberry muffins." I figured someone who grows all these amazing plants appreciates good food. "I definitely do. Thank you." We talked for a while about gardening and solar panels and the whole HOA mess. She was easy to talk to, with an infectious laugh and genuine enthusiasm for sustainable living. When she left, she mentioned that she'd love to see my greenhouse again sometime when the peppers were ready. I found myself hoping she'd take me up on that. The criminal cases moved forward through the fall. Gary Millstone pleaded guilty to multiple counts of vandalism and arson in exchange for a reduced sentence. He got 3 years in prison. Brenda Patterson went to trial in November, and I had to testify about her trespassing on my property and her general pattern of harassment. The prosecution painted a picture of someone who'd become so obsessed with control and authority that she'd lost all perspective. They showed emails where she'd ranted about people like me ruining the neighborhood, messages to HOA board members about taking stronger action, and testimony from Gary Millstone about conversations where she'd said things like, "Someone needs to teach these people a lesson." Her defense tried to argue that she'd never explicitly ordered anyone to commit crimes, that she was being prosecuted for speech rather than action. But the pattern was too clear, and the jury didn't buy it. They convicted her on multiple counts of conspiracy and solicitation. At sentencing in early December, Judge Reynolds, the same judge who'd ruled in my favor in the original case, showed no mercy. "Mrs. Patterson, you held a position of trust in your community. Instead of using that position responsibly, you created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. You treated your neighbors not as fellow community members, but as subjects who needed to obey your will. When they didn't, you incited others to commit violence against their property. You're fortunate no one was physically injured by the fire at Mr. Walsh's property, but that was luck, not design. You are sentenced to 5 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. I watched from the gallery as Brenda was led away. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. All that aggressive confidence had evaporated. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. This whole situation had been so unnecessary. In the aftermath, the Meadowbrook Hills HOA went through a complete restructuring. The remaining homeowners voted to amend the covenant significantly, reducing the board's enforcement powers and creating better oversight mechanisms. Several properties, including mine, were formally excluded from the HOA boundaries with proper legal documentation this time. My greenhouse thrived. By December, I had enough vegetables and herbs that I was giving them away to neighbors. Richard and Susan became good friends, often coming over to admire my latest planting experiments. Melissa Ortega became an even better friend, and then something more than a friend. We started dating in October, and by December she was spending most weekends at my place, helping me plan next year's greenhouse expansion. On Christmas Eve, I stood in my greenhouse surrounded by green growing things while snow fell outside. The contrast was magical, the cold winter night beyond the polycarbonate panels, the warm, humid air inside filled with life. Melissa was next to me, her hand in mine, admiring the dwarf lemon tree that had just started producing its first fruits. "You know what I love about this place," she said. "It's not just about the plants, it's about you standing up for what was right. You could have backed down, could have let them bully you into giving up something you'd worked hard to build. But you didn't." "I just wanted to grow some tomatoes," I said, smiling. "It was never just about tomatoes. It was about freedom and property rights, and not letting petty tyrants control your life." She was right, of course. The greenhouse had become a symbol of something larger, both for me and for the neighborhood. It represented the idea that people should be able to live their lives without arbitrary rules enforced by power-hungry busybodies. In January, I got a letter from Steve Wright's office. It was the final accounting of my legal fees, which the court had ordered the HOA to reimburse along with substantial additional damages. I'd been so prepared to spend my savings fighting this battle that seeing the number credited back to my account felt surreal. I used some of the money to expand the greenhouse, adding another 10 feet of length. I used more to help some of my neighbors who'd been vandalized but couldn't afford attorneys. And I put a substantial amount into a legal defense fund for homeowners fighting abusive HOAs, working with a nonprofit that Steve recommended. Spring came, and with it, a whole new growing season. The expanded greenhouse let me try even more ambitious projects. I started some heirloom corn, more varieties of peppers, and even some small watermelons in large containers. Melissa brought over her collection of orchids, and we built a special climate-controlled section just for them. The neighborhood gradually healed from the trauma of Brenda's reign. New HOA leadership focused on actual community building rather than enforcement. Organizing block parties, setting up a neighborhood watch that actually watched for crime instead of covenant violations, creating a community garden in a shared space where anyone could have a plot. I never forgot what Sergeant Morrison had told me that first day. People like Brenda don't stop just because they're told off once. He'd been right, but he'd also been incomplete. People like that don't stop until they're truly stopped, with real consequences. The legal system had worked, slowly and expensively, but ultimately effectively. By summer, My greenhouse was a neighborhood attraction. I started hosting workshops on container gardening and urban farming. Kids from the local elementary school came on field trips to learn about plants and growing food. What had started as a personal project became something that brought people together. Exactly the opposite of what Brenda had tried to achieve with her divisive enforcement. One warm July evening, I was giving a tour to a group of neighbors when someone asked me if I regretted all the trouble the greenhouse had caused. I thought about it for a moment, looking around at the thriving plants, at Melissa helping a child understand how tomatoes grow, at the community that had formed around the space. Not for a second, I said. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you time and money and peace of mind. Because if you don't, if you just roll over whenever someone tries to push you around, then what kind of life are you living? The greenhouse still stands in my backyard, larger now, more productive, a testament to the simple idea that people should be free to live their lives on their own property without harassment. Every tomato I harvest, every pepper I pick, every herb I trim is a small victory for that freedom. Brenda Patterson is serving her sentence at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville. Sometimes I wonder if she understands yet how wrong she was, how her obsession with control destroyed not just her own life, but caused real harm to people who'd done nothing wrong. I hope she does. I hope she learned something from the experience. As for me, I'm exactly where I want to be. I've got a job I enjoy, a greenhouse full of thriving plants, a wonderful woman in my life, and good neighbors who respect boundaries and treat each other with basic human decency. My property values may have gone up or down. I neither know nor care. What matters is that this is my home, my space, and I answer to no one about what I grow in my backyard. The legal documents establishing that my property is not subject to the Meadowbrook Hills HOA are filed with the county recorder's office, permanent and unambiguous. If I ever sell this place, future owners will know exactly what they're getting. A beautiful old house with a spectacular greenhouse and absolute freedom from busybody neighbors with clipboards and rulebooks. In the end, justice took time, but it came. The rule of law worked, protecting individual property rights against collective overreach. Brenda learned that no HOA covenant, no matter how carefully worded, gives anyone the right to harass, intimidate, or harm their neighbors. And I learned that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing, but it's worth it. My greenhouse stands as proof that when you stand up for your rights, when you refuse to be bullied, when you use the legal system properly and persist through adversity, you can win. Not just win in court, but win a better life, a freer life. A life lived on your own terms in your own space with your own dreams growing in the soil you tend. And really, isn't that what property ownership should be about? Not rules and restrictions and someone else's vision of perfection, but the freedom to create your own version of home, whatever that looks like. For me, it looks like a cedar-framed greenhouse full of tomatoes and peppers and possibilities, standing proudly in my backyard, a monument to the simple revolutionary act of refusing to back down.